I'm here with Cullen Roche, founder of Orcam Financial Group. Today, we're going to talk about the disdain that some market participants have for the Federal Reserve. We're going to talk about where they're wrong and where they might be right. Stick around. Cullen, so you are taking this prepping thing very seriously. You've got a nice crossbow behind you.
I'm ready to go. I'm ready for anything that comes at me.
All right, so you've been on this side for a long time. I started reading you probably like in 2010, and you navigated the world of quantitative easing through the great financial crisis, probably as well as anybody. And at the time, there were a lot of people screaming about how monetary policy was going to cause not just inflation, but hyperinflation.
Yeah.
And you were on the other side from the very beginning. So what did those people misunderstand about the very nature of quantitative easing and open market operations in general?
Yeah, I was kind of lucky, actually. It was interesting back then. And I have a couple of friends who live in Japan, worked at Nomura for what was the equivalent of the Soma desk at Nomura. So Nomura is one of the primary dealer equivalents in Japan. And when quantitative easing first started, I had no idea what this thing was going to do. I kind of was trying to understand it from a first principles perspective. So I could be like, okay, how does this thing work? And what is it going to do? How is it going to filter through the financial markets? And I talked to my buddy over there, and they'd been doing QE for 15 years by this point. And he was like, Cullen, everything that I'm reading in the American press, in the research notes, is completely wrong. This thing doesn't do what people think it does. It basically will be the equivalent of an asset swap, and it will be somewhat marginally deflationary. So the way that he always described it to me was that what really happens is the central bank creates money. They technically print money and they unprint the bond. And what happens is basically, instead of the private sector having more money, they now have, or instead of the private sector having more money in total, what they've done is they've swapped a bond for cash. And now the private sector actually has a similarly safe financial asset and lower income. So his argument was always that what's going to happen here is people have more money technically, but they have a safe asset. The Fed has unprinted the T-bond, and they've taken that extra income out of the private sector. So this thing doesn't do what people think it does. It doesn't actually, it's not printing money. It's not creating a lot of inflation. It's swapping an asset that is equally safe, but reducing the income, which actually is likely to drive interest rates down a little bit and drive inflation down a little bit.
So we've seen the amount of money in circulation. There's this great chart that we're going to throw up. The amount of money in circulation has more than doubled since the GFC. And if that doesn't cause inflation, what the hell does? I feel like, does anybody know what causes inflation? I know what the textbooks say.
Inflation is so much more complex than we've kind of all been taught in the sort of basic monetarist sense that, more money chases fewer goods and that creates inflation. And I think we've seen through QE in the last 10 years that you can print money technically, but if you're doing it at the same time that you're unprinting a T-bond, and that's, this is the thing that I think gets a lot of people. The Fed's balance sheet is not in the real economy. They're not out there using their balance sheet to go to Walmart and compete for goods and services. They take these assets off the private sector's hands, and they're basically putting them, they might as well be burying them in the backyard. I mean, they're just out, they're gone from the private sector economy. And so the private sector's composition of financial assets has changed, but it hasn't necessarily increased. And that's the one big thing with the Fed that people miss, is that the Fed doesn't actually necessarily increase the quantity of net financial assets in the private sector. That really can only be done through either an endogenous increase through things like new share issuance or new financial asset issuance, new loans from banks, or the government. The government can run a great big deficit and create net financial assets. But the central bank is not the entity that really produces the net financial assets.
So, okay, what is the Fed and the Treasury doing now versus what they did back then?
Yeah, this is pretty different. So in 2008, I actually was largely against the bailouts. I was pretty vocally against all the bank bailouts, the GM bailout, I remember the cash for clunkers program, like all this stuff. I kind of thought it was nonsense. My view basically then was this was an asset bubble. We reap what we sow, and we kind of need to go through this pricing adjustment to recalibrate the economy to some degree. And this one's just so different to me because this is more like an act of God, and the government is basically responding with all of these shutdowns, basically mandating a closure of the economy. And so it's different in the sense that I think that the programs that they're implementing, either whether it's the Fed's programs or the congressional program, the $1,200 checks and the increase in unemployment benefits, to me it makes a lot more sense, mainly because this sort of act of God with a mandated shutdown warrants some sort of government response. And I think the thing that really pisses a lot of people off is that Congress was very slow to act. And in the meantime that they were slow to act, the Fed really picked up the slack. And so
How so?
well, they have so much leniency and flexibility with the way that they can operate. I mean, they were ramping up all these programs while Congress was kind of twiddling their thumbs. The Fed was just ramping up program after program after program. And that's the thing that makes the Fed so controversial, is that the Section 13.3 disclosure in the Federal Reserve Act, which is the exigent circumstances clause, it's so open-ended that they can virtually do anything through the banking system with that power. And
So are they breaking the law, as Gunlock and some others have suggested?
No. This was I remember when this was all litigated after the financial crisis, because the same people said all that stuff after the GFC. They said the Fed has too much power. We need to, shut them down to some degree. And the Dodd-Frank rule actually, it put kind of clamps on the Section 13.3 clause. And so, for instance, the Treasury now has to validate, they have to sign off basically on all of the programs that the Fed does. So, Jerome Powell had to get a unanimous vote basically from the rest of the board, and then he has to go to the Secretary of the Treasury and say, hey, this is what we want to do. Will you sign off on this? So this was all litigated back in 2013, basically. The Fed changed the 13.3 clause, and it's still so open-ended that it's hard to decipher whether or not the Fed is even coming close to doing anything illegal, because the rule is so open-ended.
So what are some of the biggest gripes that you have with people who loathe the Fed?
I think the big one that bothers me right now is this narrative going around, and it became really popular after the CNBC interview with the Warriors owner. Yeah. He said that you could basically cram down equity without hurting the workers. And this is it's total bunk. That's just not how it works. Like, I remember the GM bankruptcy. In 2008, GM fired 35,000 people. So this is what people miss, is that the process on getting to bankruptcy is extraordinarily damaging for a firm, and mainly the labor class, because what's happening is the equity holders are basically, they're using the workers as their shield to protect the equity as the equity declines in value. So they're protecting the liability side of the balance sheet. They're firing workers all along the way. So GM fires 35,000 people in 2008. Then they get their bailout in February 2009, and they restructure. And by restructure, they fired 10,000 more. So by the end of all this, the equity has been crammed down, but the labor class gets crammed down too. And there's really no way to avoid hurting the labor class without also hurting the equity class, because they're not that they're one and the same, but they're interconnected in a firm in ways that makes it just virtually impossible to help one without helping the other.
So what are some of the points that the other side, meaning the people that loathe the Fed, what are some of the points they make that you actually say, you know what, that's valid?
I think the junk bond thing is a valid critique. For instance, they were given the power to buy like HYG, which is one of these high yield ETFs. And that to me, operationally, it makes no sense, because what they're going in and doing basically is they're buying the bonds on the secondary market. It doesn't fund the companies. It doesn't help the underlying bonds in any way. It's basically just trying to boost the asset prices. And so that is a very valid critique. If you're going to try to help these firms, you really need to go to the source. You need to give them money like they did through the small business loan program that just got tapped out this morning. That thing was giving money directly to small businesses. That's a great way to implement this policy if you're trying to.
Anything else?
I think that helping asset managers is controversial, in that you see a lot of these hedge fund guys, and there were reports that a lot of like venture capital firms were tapping these loan programs, and that stuff to me is also controversial, because these are firms that, like you and I, we can work from anywhere. Asset managers can basically work from anywhere, and if you were bailing out, for instance, equity managers every time the market went down 30% or 20%, I mean, we'd be getting bailouts, once every 18 months. It just, to me, that part of the program also doesn't make a lot of sense. So there's some fair critiques of this, but for the most part, I think that for the most part, the programs are good. They're trying to basically build a bridge for, 3 to 6 months, hoping that the virus kind of goes away and that we can kind of get back to normal during the mandated shutdown.
So how responsible really is the Federal Reserve for two big issues? One are inflating assets, and the big one is directly causing inequality. And Chamath tweeted this chart going around, which is showing U.S. private sector financial assets as a percentage of GDP. And what he said was, inequality and anti-capitalism in one chart. The Fed for the last 25 years have used their tools and money to preserve equity and credit prices at all costs. As a result, when economies contract, average people get hurt. Capitalists and progressives should both puke this chart up. What do you say to this?
I mean, the big problem with that chart is that chart basically just shows what any long-term trend in a developed economy is going to look like. I mean, literally every single developed economy will have, over the long term, a chart where the quantity of financial assets outpaces GDP, mainly because as you start getting a more and more developed financial economy, you just start getting more and more financial assets. You start getting things that are more sophisticated, like insurance policies or options contracts, and all these different types of financial assets that they aren't necessarily bad, but they're built and structured to protect the financial system itself in various ways. And so, I don't know, there's definitely a problem of inequality in the country, but I don't think that chart is is necessarily the thing that actually shows the problem. That just kind of shows what a developed economy financial system is going to look like over any long-term trend.
Yeah, I mean, do you understand why people's inclination is to blame the Fed?
Honestly, I think a lot of it just comes down to politics. I think people do not like the government intervening in the markets, and the Fed is just a great, big, divisive entity that is consistently intervening in the financial markets, and people don't like that.
All right, that's a great place to leave it. Cullen, thank you so much.